In this next section, we're going to talk about inequalities. And mostly here we're just going to look at the different properties and notation for inequalities, because most inequalities are going to be solved just like our linear, quadratic, rational, radical type equations. Okay, so a linear inequality is anything of the form ax plus by greater than c, where this greater than can be any of our inequality symbols. Less than, greater than, less than or equal to, greater than or equal to, or not equal to. Okay? And some of the properties that we get for these inequalities are the following. If our A is less than or equal to B, the first property says that our inequalities have the same properties of equality that our equations do. Meaning, if I take some real number C and add it to both sides of the equation, my inequality is preserved. Okay. If C is positive, then my multiplicative property is preserved. So A being less than or equal to B says that AC is going to be less than or equal to BC. And note here again that C has to be greater than 0. If C is less than or equal to 0, first off, if it's equal to 0, this doesn't hold. But if it's less than 0, then what happens is my inequality is flipped. Okay. And again here, even though I'm adding or multiplying, remember it works for subtraction and division as well. Okay. Then we have almost a combined property. If I have two inequalities where A is less than B and C is less than D, then the combination of those two expressions can be equivalent. Meaning A plus C, the smaller ends of those have to be less than or equal to the bigger ends. Over here we'll talk a little bit about the notation for inequality solutions. And I've started by writing up the inequalities because in most cases you may be asked to solve an absolute value and it'll turn out to be one of these inequality notations. You could be asked to put that in any of three forms: the inequality, the interval notation, or the graphical notation. Okay. So here, if my solution looks like x between negative and positive c, but not including those values, then here what I'm looking at is that the absolute value of x is going to be less than c. Okay. The interval notation, again, we use parentheses to show not inclusive. And on our graph, we use open circles to show not including. Okay. In this case, same type of thing. The only difference is now we're including the solutions. So here we'll get the equality. Same thing, when we come down here, that just means I'm now going to have brackets instead of parentheses. And on the graph, it just means I'm looking at closed circles instead of open circles. Okay. For these, this is just going the other direction. So notice now, I can't write this as a single inequality, and that's the first thing to note. When you're writing these inequalities, they should make sense on the number line. So in this case, if I look, negative c is always less than c on the number line. But in this case, even though I'm looking at the same values, I can't just flip those inequalities and write it as 1, because negative c is never going to be greater than c. So here I actually do have to write it as 2 inequalities, but if I come back to the absolute value, all it's saying is that my absolute value of x is greater than c. In terms of the interval notation, this is where we're going to use our union that we talked about before. We're looking at everything less than negative c, again not including, everything bigger than c, again not including, and we want the union of those two sets. And so on our graph, we're just looking at the ends. Okay. And so you can kind of see where this last one is going. Again, I've got less than or equal to negative c or greater than or equal to c. So my absolute value of x is going to be greater than or equal to c. My inequalities, again, I'm going to have to use my union, but now I get to include those end values. And again, notice in both cases here, I don't put brackets on infinity. Infinity is always going to be open because we don't have an actual value to make the end. So here is what my graphical notation would look like. Again, the ends, but including or closed circles for those c values. Okay. So for some of these, you're going to be asked to solve some sort of absolute value. And if your solution comes out to be an absolute value in one of these forms, or an inequality in one of these forms, then you can see your other notations.